Hello, Indian Creek 8th grade students. This is Mr. Roush, bringing you the fourth video in our Reconstruction series, The Change in the South. So we just finished up talking about the KKK and the different sharecropping, and now we're going to talk about all the different changes that happened in the South. During the Grant administration, Northerners began losing interest in Reconstruction. Many believed it was time for the South to solve its own problems. By 1876, Southern Democrats were regaining political and economic control in the South. Some freedmen and women went back to work for landholders because they had no other way to make a living. In the early 1870s, the Republicans were fed up with all of the corruption in Grant's administration, so they formed a new group of liberal Republicans led by Horace Greeley. This group of liberal Republicans proposed peaceful reconciliation or coming together again with Southern whites. Greeley ran against Grant in the 1872 presidential election. The Democrats also supported Greeley for the president because he offered a chance to defeat the Republicans. Despite the divisions in the Republican ranks, however, Grant was reelected. During the 1872 election campaign, liberal Republicans called for expanded amnesty for white Southerners. In May of 1872, Congress passed the Amnesty Act, which pardoned most former Confederates. Nearly all white Southerners could now vote or hold office again. The amnesty changed the political balance in the South by restoring full rights to people who supported the Democratic Party. With the Amnesty Act and the help of the KKK, the Democrats were able to regain power. The Democrats regained control of Virginia and North Carolina. They did this by the KKK terrorizing Republican voters, and Democrats also used threats to pressure the white Republicans into voting Democrat. The Republicans also had a bunch of issues. Some of their issues were corruption and economic depression were blamed on the Republicans in the South. So the South didn't really like the Republicans. In 1874, the Democrats won control of the federal government. They gained Senate seats and control of the House of Representatives. With all of the corruption and problems in the Republican Party, the only three states in the South to remain Republican were Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. President Ulysses S. Grant considered running for a third term in 1876. Most Republican leaders preferred a new candidate, one who could win back the liberal Republicans and unite the party. That candidate was Rutherford B. Hayes, who was governor of Ohio and had moderate views on Reconstruction. The Democrats nominated Samuel Tilden, who was governor of New York, and he was known for fighting corruption in New York. After the election, Tilden appeared to be the winner, receiving almost 250,000 more votes than Hayes. However, disputed returns from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, which represented 20 electoral votes, kept the outcome in doubt. Tilden had only 184 electoral votes, only one short of what he needed to win. Yet if Hayes received all 20 of the disputed votes, he would have the 185 electoral votes required for a victory. In January, Congress created a special commission or group of 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent to review the election results. But the independent resigned and a Republican took his place. After examining the reports of state review boards, the commission voted 8-7 to award all 20 disputed votes and the election to Hayes. The vote followed party lines. So here's a map of the United States and who voted Republican and who voted Democrat. The Republicans are in red and the Democrats are in blue. So if you see Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, received 185 electoral votes, but he was about 250,000 shy of the popular vote. But it takes the electoral votes to win, so he was the one who became president. The deal congressional leaders made to settle the election dispute was the Compromise of 1877, which included various favors to the South. The new government would give more aid to the region and withdraw all remaining troops from the South. The Democrats in turn, promised to maintain African Americans' rights. During a trip to the South, Rutherford B. Hayes announced his intention of letting Southerners handle the racial issues. Hayes' message was clear. The federal government would no longer attempt to reshape Southern society or help Southern African Americans. Reconstruction was over. I am treated not as an American citizen, but as a brute. And for what? Not that I am unable or unwilling to pay my way, not that I am obnoxious in my personal appearance or disrespectful in my conduct, but simply because I happen to be a darker complexion. These words were spoken by John Lynch, a member of Congress who had once been enslaved. At the end of Reconstruction, many African Americans faced lives of poverty, indignity, and despair. Many Southern whites hated Republicans because of their role in the Civil War and Reconstruction, so they created a new party of Southern Democrats called Redeemers. They were called Redeemers because they saved the South from Republican rule. The Redeemers adopted conservative policies such as lower taxes, less public spending, and reduced government services. They drastically cut or even eliminated many social services started during Reconstruction, including public education. Their one-party rule and conservative policies dominated Southern policies well into the 1900s. Many of the people in the South were looking forward to a new South. They were going to develop a strong industrial economy. In the economy, they were going to mine for coal, iron, cotton, lumber, and other local resources. They wanted to have a peaceful competition with the North, where they were able to trade goods or get along with each other. Some of the Southern industries were textile mills, because they had all that cotton down there, tobacco, lumber, and iron and steel. And a lot of people from the North even moved south to work in some of the Southern industries. They needed people to work in the steel mills and in the lumber yards and in the textile mills. Also, they were able to grow with a cheap, reliable workforce. Many people were willing to work long hours for very little pay. Supporters of the New South hoped to change Southern agriculture as well as industry. They pictured small, profitable farms raising a variety of crops rather than large plantations devoted to growing cotton. But many landowners kept control of their properties. Some of the plantations were broken up, and those were split up into tenant farmers and sharecroppers, which took over that land. But debt caused problems as well. Poor farmers had to buy on credit to get the food and supplies they needed. The merchants who sold on credit charged high prices for their goods, increasing the farmers' debt. And the quickest way for farmers to repay that debt, they thought, was to grow cash crops, or crops that could be sold for money. And the biggest cash crop was cotton. But the problem was, there was an oversupply of cotton. So with supply and demand, if there's too much cotton, the price goes down because there's so much cotton. So the farmers thought they would just grow more cotton to make a profit. But that just backfired, and the rural South sank deeper into poverty and in debt. As Reconstruction ended, African Americans' dreams for justice faded. In the last 20 years of the 1800s, racism became firmly entrenched, and individuals took steps to keep African Americans separated from whites and deny them basic rights. One of the basic rights that they were denied was voting. The 15th Amendment prohibited any state from denying an individual the right to vote because of race. Southern leaders, however, found ways to get around the amendment and prevent African Americans from voting. One of those is a poll tax, which is a fee people had to pay before voting, which many of the African Americans couldn't afford, and it also prevented the poor whites from voting. So that was a way to prevent the African Americans and the poor whites from voting, which usually would vote Republican. The other way African Americans were prevented from voting was by a literacy test, where the voters had to be able to read and explain difficult parts of the Constitution before they were able to vote. Now, this prevented African Americans from voting, and still the poor white Southerners who were not able to read or write. But there was a grandfather clause, where you would be able to vote if your father or grandfathers were able to vote before. So since African Americans could not vote until 1867, they were excluded from this. Another set of laws that hurt African Americans were called Jim Crow laws. By the 1890s, segregation, or the separate of the races, was a prominent feature of life in the South. Jim Crow laws required African Americans and whites to be separate in all public places, or places where they might come in contact with each other. In 1896, the Supreme Court upheld the Jim Crow laws and segregation in Plessy v. Ferguson. The case involved a Louisiana law requiring separate sections on trains for African Americans. The court ruled that segregation was legal as long as African Americans had access to public facilities or accommodations equal to those of whites. The problem, however, was that the facilities were separate but in no way equal. Southern states spent much more money on schools and other facilities for whites than those of African Americans. This separate but equal doctrine provided a legal foundation for segregation in the South that lasted for more than 50 years. Reconstruction was both a success and a failure. It helped the South recover from the war and began rebuilding its economy. Yet economic recovery was far from complete. Although Southern agriculture took a new form, the South was still in a rural economy, and the economy was still very poor. Under Reconstruction, African Americans also gained greater equality and began creating their own institutions. They joined with whites in new governments, fairer and more democratic than the South had ever seen. This improvement for African Americans did not last long, however. The biggest disappointment of Reconstruction was that it did not make good on the promise of the true freedom for freed African Americans. The South soon created a segregated society. That's all we have for today. I hope you enjoyed our lesson on Reconstruction. Have a great day.